Hi, everyone, and welcome to another issue, episode, series of the Mid Atlantic podcast. Today is July 23rd, 2026, and I am joined today by Leah Brown. Is that right? Leah Brown, Roifield, who is like Madonna now, only goes by one name. Denise Hamilton, who is our political wonderkind from the great state of Texas, and Logan Michael Phillips, our favorister of the day, always makes polls that I agree with. So let's jump right into it. We're going to do the UK first, United Kingdom, United States, alphabetically then. We're going to do the United Kingdom first. Andy Burnham, is he a savior or a scapegoat? Let's hear from the Brits.
I think it's got to be a bit of both, and that's not a cop-out. I think there are two things going on. There clearly wasn't a suitable candidate from within the cohort of MPs that were elected in 2024, which is why he's been wheeled in. But there's also a sense of public frustration, and by using effectively an outsider and bringing him in, there's someone to throw under the bus come December when the media decides it's had enough. I don't think either of those approaches are appropriate. I don't think that we should ever look to our leaders to be saviors, nor do I think it's fair or respectful to hold somebody out to dry. But hopefully he'll buck the trend. If his social media is anything to go by, he's already ahead of the game. So
couldn't agree more with the line about social media. He feels like a politician for the time, for the age. Regardless of whether he gets it right or not, he feels 2026. And what our political class has suffered from, I would say, 2008 itis, in that whether it's been David Cameron, Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak, etc., they've done politics as if to say that the economic growth of Britain hasn't been stifled for the last almost 20 years. Here we have somebody who says we are in some level of a national crisis and we need renewal, but also his messaging is new. So that is at least to be welcomed so far.
So he's a touchy-feely version of Keir Starmer?
No, because Keir Starmer didn't say, country, we're in a bit of a hole and we need to tackle the cost of living crisis in practical ways, whether it's being taken off energy, whether it is help to the hospitality industry. He's actually not just said these things, he has the policies for it. Time will tell whether they'll be successful there.
Leah, you're optimistic?
I am an optimist by nature. I am not optimistic about the current situation, and I haven't been able to put my finger on why. I think its roots sit in repair. Everybody who knows me knows I'm obsessed with repair, and I feel like with this much turmoil, this much change, the defense ministers resigned 2 minutes ago. Wes Streeting resigned as health secretary 2 minutes ago. So there's already been a transition of those departments. And then with Burnham's arrival, there's another change. I don't think we have as much resilience as we need in the civil service to be able to deal with these shocks. And I think my issue is we've hailed in a new leader. Wonderful. We reorganized everything. Wonderful. It's summer break. Wonderful. But underneath the surface, what's going on beneath the water? It's absolute utter chaos. We're consolidating departments. We don't know where the budget is coming from. We don't know how these promises are going to be funded. And I think when Labour were elected in 2024, underneath all of the social media posts were people being like, yay, Labour, change is coming. This is really positive. Now, if you look at any news alert where any comment on a policy or a person features, the comments are all the public has schooled themselves up on what is going on, and they've got all these conspiracy theories, and there's a lot of concern about Israel funding things and politicians not declaring their donations and people having mixed motives and conflicts of interest. And I think there's a sense in which this hasn't brought in a new regime. It's just a different leader at the helm. And I feel like there is sadness about that is tempering my optimism, because I feel like the mood on the ground is discordant with Burnham's social media.
Correct answer is unless Burnham starts taking on massive amounts of debt on behalf of the country in order to implement the infrastructure upgrades you are desperately in need of, he's going to be back in the same situation. I will also say that I had viewed the Labour Party as not as factionalized as the Conservatives were. Obviously, the whole split off of reform. And I think what has happened is that there now is a Starmer loyalist faction and a Burnham loyalist faction. And I'm interested to see how that's going to play out in the voting going forward. Unless you Americans want to stick your nose in, any thoughts on Burnham? Nope. Happy? Great.
Yeah, I'll put in a few things here. I think I've been looking at the polls, right? And to some degree, voters are giving him a chance, at least early on. He's coming in with higher favorables than the last few prime ministers, the highest since Theresa May. And so I think what we're seeing at the very least is that they're giving him a chance. They're skeptical. They're not all in, but a positive approval rating, I feel like in the UK is the equivalent of a 60% approval rating in America. It is not happen that often. Now, having that from day one is different than having that in a month and having that in a few weeks, in a few months and over the course of the year. But I do think to some degree, he is starting off in a smart way, which is every day he's releasing a new development that he's pursuing. Now, I know a lot of these are what us Americans might call singles and doubles. I forgot as my mind was forming that sentence that the audience is not necessarily going to know that one.
It carries over
And
to ones and twos. Nobody's hitting sixes.
fantastic. As a result, I think to some degree, when you're in a tough time, and I think you're right, Michael, that there are some fundamental problems here that are very hard to change, especially in the short term, without perhaps rejoining the EU. You're going to have to show people, if you're going to be viewed as a successful leader, what you're doing to change their lives and make the case that you're making things better. I think there are times, it is very tough to pull off, but there are certainly times where there are popular leaders in tough economic times because people can see this person is making their life better. And so if he is really ends up being very strong on social media and can show those changes, even if they're not changing the entire of the structure, he can still be potentially reasonably popular. And we'll see if he can do it.
Yeah, you get a point. I think one of Starmer's failures was not communicating his successes, and which he had a significant number of.
It wasn't just he didn't communicate his successes, he wasn't a communicator, full stop. And in this social media savvy age, you need someone who can at least communicate. That's it. And regardless of whether you're pro-Trump or anti-Trump, Trump is an amazing communicator. That gets you half of the way there. It gets people to believe in your vision. It gets people behind you. Keir Starmer was a technocrat, and the Labour Party thought they needed a technocrat after the repeated failures of the last various Conservative administrations. However, we're in a social media age, and we are looking aghast at Mandami. We are in Britain. That he has revitalised the Green Party and half of the Labour Party just because he's able to communicate. And that cannot be underestimated. And the clever thing about it is you can circumnavigate traditional antagonistic media as well.
Yeah. Just like several hundred years ago, you're trying to encroach on our territory. So let's just slow the Mandami roll until we get to the Americans, okay? What I really want to talk about is when you talk about social media and people who leverage social media well, why don't we go towards Clacton and talk about everybody's favorite, are you going to bin your vote and vote for Count Binface? Would you rather people didn't vote at all, or do you want to vote for the meme candidate, or how do you think that should go? Roifield or Leah? Yeah. If you lived in Clacton, what would you do?
First of all, I would never live in Clacton. But if I did live in Clacton, I would be voting for Binface. And I think that one of the wonderful quirks of the way that the media rules operate in the UK means that every time they need to interview Nigel, they also need to interview Binface, which means that he's had quite a lot of airtime. And I feel like he's an insightful guy. He has a lot to say. He shows up at all of these very high-profile elections in the UK. And I think it is greatly ironic that he's been so heavily featured because he's never had that opportunity before. I think it will be really interesting to see what the outcome is of the vote. But I think Nigel has a very, how do I put this, niche audience in Clacton, who it doesn't matter what information you put before them, they will be hoodwinked by it. And so I just love the fact, really, that he's not been able to get that airtime during the Burnham transition time because he is currently the candidate in a by-election. So I think that's a wonderful quirk of our rules that he's had to pipe down a little bit. But I also think that it it represents the democratic process, right? It shouldn't be a shoe-in. The existing incumbent shouldn't necessarily be the shoe-in for a position. And I think the fact that all of the rest of the parties have said, nope, we're not in this one. We don't agree with the fact that you've called this by-election at all. I think good on him. Good on Binface for running a clean race.
I must admit, the candidacy of Binface makes me proud to be British. And I can only imagine how Americans are looking at this by-election, as we call it, special election, as you'd call it, whereby somebody who wears a trash can on his head is running and he has a significant chance of actually winning the seat. And he is a joke candidate. But the power of this is that this is an anti-Farage, an anti, I would say, xenophobic vote. Leah said she wouldn't live in Clacton. Clacton is a highly deprived seaside town. With the advent of cheap travel to Europe, traditional seaside towns, which is where the working class would go on their holidays, have been neglected. There's a reason why in this neglected bit of Britain, they voted for Farage, because these people are angry. However, whether you agree with his politics or not, he's a terrible MP. He doesn't turn up to the constituency. He doesn't run surgeries. He doesn't even mention Clacton whilst talking in Parliament, and he doesn't even turn up to Parliament. He's a bad MP, and for that reason alone, everyone should vote Binface.
I do just want to add, I do live in a deprived seaside constituency that Farage previously ran in under the old UKIP days. And I do think that it's been really interesting to see how people have responded to reform down here. And I think there are a huge number of closet reform voters. But one of the byproducts of the many by-elections we've been having is that reform have had an extended opportunity to exhibit. And it feels like the more coverage that they get, the more opportunities that they get to showcase who they are, what they stand for, and how they operate, the fewer people are captured or captivated by their message. So as I say, I think it'd be really interesting, but you're absolutely right, Roifield. I couldn't agree with you more. Farage is a terrible MP. And ultimately, if you cannot represent the interests of your constituency in Parliament, what are you doing there?
The cynical would say he is representing the constituents of Clacton.
Oh, surely you mean the constituents of Thailand, those crypto billionaires in Thailand that have that constituency are well served by Nigel Farage.
Right. Logan, do you have any insight to who's polling and who's winning?
I do not, but this guy sounds like our version of Vermin Supreme, except he can actually win a race. This is a guy that runs for president every year, came to my college once, has a toothbrush that's as tall as he is, and wears a boot on his hat. And it's pretty funny to imagine Vermin Supreme having a genuine chance at being elected.
The reason that Binface is successful is really the same reason that Burnham has been successful. He's honest. You get what you see or don't see with him, but his promises are modest, and there's a sense of sincerity about him. All right, I'm going to share a quick video of Nigel Farage and try to get your input on it.
Yeah. She would be doing that again. Yeah.
Right. So my question also to the Brits is, assuming he loses, is this the car crash ending of Farage's career? Does he slink away to Russia or whatever other, Thailand maybe, as you mentioned, Roifield? Or does he still have a future in politics if he loses?
If that question's to me, absolutely not. Yeah. No. With the second coming of Trump, it's proven that you can be a very divisive politician and rest on your base, but just have enough outreach to be elected to come back. So my gut is to say he's utterly would be finished by a man who dresses with a trash can or a bin on his head. But nothing that politics has all been turned on its head in the last 10 years. So who's to say if he couldn't make a comeback? What I would say, though, however, is that Reform are sliding down the opinion polls. Even right-leaning British press have turned on them. And even GB News, which is our equivalent to Fox, has turned on Farage, saying you did need to call this election, this by-election, and you had something to answer with not declaring this £5 million. So it looks like Reform are retreating. And I think we could actually be seeing in British politics the slow re-emergence of two-party politics. We could. Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservatives, is polling very well. She's being very effective now in Parliament. And Andy Burnham, I believe, will get some level of a bounce.
If Starmer loses in Clacton, is his political career
Farage.
over?
Farage.
Starmer already lost. Sorry, Farage. If Farage loses in Clacton, is his political career over? Starmer's is already over.
I think he is the epitome of what we call a jammy dodger. And I don't think his career will end if he loses. Unfortunately, I don't think he's going to lose. I think if you've got that much money behind you, you're going to win. Their whole campaign strategy of recording on an iPhone by the side of the road is just bizarre. But it seems to be compelling hearts and minds. I think part of this is down to the proportional representation system and how that all works. But I think he is trying to make a career against the establishment, which is deeply ironic because he is clearly part of the establishment. But he will find a way because there is money to be made. If you just look at the register of interest of all the jobs that he currently holds that are not the MP, he will be politics adjacent. He just loves the limelight, so he will find a way. And I think never say never. He always said that Clacton was his last hurrah to be an MP. He'd tried so many times. I think it would be royally embarrassing if he were to lose, and he'd probably go into hiding for a little bit and blame the whole world. But I don't think, unfortunately, it would be the end of his political career because he seems to be like a multi-headed hydra. You can cut off one limb and it just keeps growing back.
Logan?
So I have a question for you guys. It seems to some degree like he is clearly one of the most enthusiastic supporters for Brexit, one of its architects, and yet it is viewed decisively now in the UK as a negative thing that has hurt the country. So if we're really going to an election where he is at the head of Reform, wouldn't this hurt him to some degree? Because you can say he's one of the principal architects of a lot of the current problems that the UK is struggling with.
He was Mr. Brexit. He's not one of the principal architects. He, since the early 2000s, was campaigning as this person who's outside politics for us to leave the European Union. And because of that, I would say he's single-handedly the most consequential British politician of the last 20 years. He is. And he did it outside of the political structures. However, I think we've hit peak Farage. As to whether he should be truly be held to account for the dismal economic performance of Britain post-Brexit, I think slowly but surely our political class, but I think more importantly than that, the media is saying we shit the bed here. If you look at every metrics of our expected GDP on the trajectory before that vote for Brexit, we are 2, 3, depending on what metric you look at, 2, 3, 8%, 10% poorer than we would have been. One thing I would say, though, is the problems of the economic stagnation of Britain aren't just down to Brexit. Since 2008, or at least since 2010, with austerity with the Cameron administration, we've become poorer. It's just that Brexit has exacerbated that. So Farage could say, look at the economic performance of Britain before that vote. So it's a complicated thing, but I think fundamentally, yes, we've become poorer because of Brexit. And our media is now starting to say this, and you hear the whispers within our political class as well. But we're not going to anytime soon. It'll be too divisive.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I also think never underestimate the power of articulating grievance. And when lose, he is a powerful communicator of grievance for populations that feel underrepresented or some kind of under siege in some way. And especially when you have the courage to say what is unpopular or feels unkind or cruel, there is a currency in being able to do that on a consistent basis. I think he will be back, even if he loses.
So you're right. Leah is correct. Grifter's gonna grift, and there's no stopping that train. But to touch on what Roifield was talking about, I guess my last question for the Brits is, does Andy Burnham's election move the possibility of the UK rejoining the EU further, or does it increase the chances that it's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years closer to reality? And if they do, is Britain willing to give up the pound in order to rejoin the EU?
Two big questions in that. I think I'll leave the pound for a second. I think the bigger problem is that a general election will be called before consensus is reached on what to do about Brexit. And depending on how quickly Andy Burnham can implement some solutions that alleviate some of the challenges that Britons face, versus what is this 10-year plan to which he continues to refer? And does that involve Brexit? Does that not? At the moment, we don't have enough information. All we know is that if Reform were to get in, they would not be advocating for a greater relationship with Europe. And honestly, I don't think that the Conservatives would either. And so I think we're in a situation where the only way in which overturning Brexit in any way, shape, or form becomes possible is if there is both a general election and if Labour win. And those two things do not seem like they would be possible. So I think we're stuck in a democratic crisis of our own making as a result of the decisions that we made in the original referendum. And I think if they were really smart, they would do a referendum without the general election.
I would slightly disagree with Leah here in that it is possible that in this new Conservative Party that the Remainers would have a stronger voice. In effect, what has happened to the right wing of the Conservative Party, it's left and gone to Reform. And those were people who voted for Brexit. So it's possible. However, the biggest thing that needs to happen for us to wholesale reevaluate our European membership is economic growth. If we have economic growth in the next 3 years and people feel it and we become happier again, I can see us in 10 years, not 5, 10 years rejoining the European Union. But we need economic growth, strong, consistent economic growth, and we need to feel it in our cities. I think one of the reasons why I'm so positive about Andy Burnham is that he's talking about not just regional devolution, but how, in effect, how important our cities are for economic growth. And it's one of the reasons why Britain is so now relatively poor compared to all of our economic rivals is because our cities underperform. If we can feel economic growth in Birmingham, Manchester, Belfast, Liverpool, those places will have a whole sea change in terms of the reappraisal of our position in Europe. And remember, with that vote with Brexit, the younger people were, the more they were pro-European. Without wanting to be too mawkish about it, those people that voted for Brexit are older and are starting to die, and the younger Brits who are more pro-European are now coming into their economic and political maturity.
I also just think it's worth noting that in polling, it's at worst, the worst I've ever seen is plus 10% in favor of rejoining. Sometimes it's plus 20. So things can change once you have a competitive election and people are arguing for it. But I also think there's a scenario where whenever this becomes an issue, if there's a referendum or even an election based off where if Labour says if we win, we will do a referendum. If this ends up becoming a defining issue, that's incredibly positive for them. Because especially if Conservatives and Reform take up the mantle of wanting to remain when a significant number of folks blame this for all the current problems. So honestly, I'm a little surprised by the hesitancy because to me, you win elections by finding the issue that divides the public strongly in your favor in a way that can change the entire conversation of the election, which is particularly useful when your party is unpopular. and forces your opponent to take an unpopular position. So I know it was divisive, but it also seems like to me it is just so at the core of every single challenge for economic growth that while it would improve the UK's negotiating position in rejoining, I personally think, again, from the outside here, that it makes sense to do it sooner rather than later.
What I'd say, Logan, is it cannot be underestimated how British politics got turned on its head by that Brexit vote. We had prime ministers come and go. We had the average tenure of a British prime minister was more than one election before the Brexit vote, right? You came in, you came into power, and you lasted more than just the 4 to 5 year term afterwards. We've now gone through, was it 7 prime ministers in 10 years? Like you cannot understand how divisive that vote was and the political fallout. We had a fringe candidate, Nigel Farage, who then, because of that victory, and remember, on the day of that victory, on the eve of that victory, he conceded because he thought this was just like, of course, we're never going to win this. The whole political calculus in Britain has been ripped up because of that Brexit vote, really because of economic stagnation, but that is the totem. And to put everything back together again, it's going to take time. The wounds of Brexit, say that again, the wounds of Brexit won't be put together and healed because in this economic cycle, the wounds of Brexit won't be healed in this political cycle. This is a 10-year project. And the other thing I disagree with you about, Logan, is you said our negotiating power to go back into the EU, it's going to be terrible. We flounced out, and then we're going to, in effect, come cap in hand, begging to rejoin. We are not going to get the favourable terms that we had before. We're absolutely not. The EU doesn't need Britain needs the EU.
Denise, any thoughts on Brexit? Or did you want to contribute on?
I think it's I'm watching it closely, this kind of like how you recover. What do you do after what I would name as a traumatic rift in a country's politics? I think the U.S. is going to have to reckon with this in a couple of years of like, how are we going to look back on the Trump years and what do we do to recover, to move forward? And when you make decisions about recovery, how much is it punitive? How does it change the negotiating power, trust? So many of the elements feel so familiar and similar of just anybody can make a mistake, but it's how you get over it that is important. And our ability to get over it, I look to the UK and Brexit to contemplate about how we're going to do it in the US.
For the Brits, did you have family members excommunicating other family members because of their opinion on Brexit? Did it ever reach that level of animosity? And I think that's the difference. I think you're right about everything, but I think our trauma is a little bit deeper than theirs.
I don't know. No. Ours is receding. But to your point, though, Mike, did we excommunicate family members? I've said this a few times on the podcast. The only time a good West Indian boy put the phone down on his mother was when my mother told me she voted for Brexit. So was he excommunicated? No. But I was shocked that my mother, a woman who came to Britain as an immigrant in the 1960s, could take this, for me, xenophobic language and vote for Brexit. And I don't think I'm particularly unique to say that people fell out with family members because of it. However, that trauma of Brexit is receding in the British psyche.
But I'll also add the trauma of the insurrection receded, right? And then here we are back again with a Trump. So I think it's like punctuation of where you are in the story. And I like to step back and look at all of it as opposed to each individual event and what the lessons are. And I think there are tons of lessons. And I think we're going to be pushed to have a lot of really tough decisions. The think tanks and things that I'm invited to be a part of, this is one of the central issues of, do you heal and move forward, or do you hunt down with tar and feathers to penalize people. How do you move forward after a rift like this? And there's a lot of regret about not taking a stronger position after the insurrection, which is more where I see this idea of receding frustration and versus kind of poignant, sharp frustration that we're in right now.
You know that Republican groups don't have that dilemma. They're not having those conversations.
They actually are. They actually are. There's a lot of fear. I've worked with both groups and fear of what's the backlash. It's so terrible. The performance is so inconsistent with what they thought they were going to get. They just wanted a little bit of toxic. They didn't want a poisonous dose. They wanted like a little arsenic. That's enough to make you buzz, but not enough to damage the country. And the fact that we are in this space, how do they even move forward? Think of Tucker Carlson and think of how they're now pivoting to be like, oh my gosh, look how terrible they are, and aligning themselves with people on the left to kind of say, aren't they terrible? I think that we're going to have some really interesting dynamics. Everybody in the country is having this conversation of what do we do now? What happens next?
So here's the reality. If Labor were an American restaurant chain, they'd be Waffle House. For years now, they have been unable to take a firm stance on anything regarding breakfast. I went through a completely hairless period because Corbyn couldn't figure out if he was go or stay or whatever. And it kills me. But Roifield is right, but for the wrong reasons. His logic is sound. Britain hasn't suffered enough yet to have the motivation to rejoin the EU properly. We need another 10 years of really harsh economic conditions in order to get that public groundswell of we're going to eat crow, we're going to join on whatever terms we need to join on. And I would argue that economic success in the next year, 2 years, 3 years completely dissolves that need, that desire. It only reinforces to people that, yeah, you know what, we should have Brexited. We should have Brexited earlier. We're Brexiting so hard right now. We're making all this money.
You're wrong. And because remember, the demographic is that generally older voters voted for Brexit. Otherwise, you'd be correct.
I think I'm correct anyway.
Not with this statement, you're not, sir. But anyway, it's your podcast. I'll say no more.
Agree to disagree. Leah, I know you have to run. I think we're wrapped up. Unless you have any final thoughts you want to kick in. Did we touch on all the things you wanted to touch on?
I think so. Nothing else to add. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Leah. Thanks for contributing. Appreciate it.
Safe travels.
We're now going to turn our gaze inward, so to speak. Roifield, you can still participate from afar. But let's talk about U.S. politics for a minute. We have not been entirely calm and complacent while the Brits have been roiling things up over there. Obviously, we have the ongoing situation in Iran. I forget, are we at war or not at war right now? I think we're I think you could flip a coin and have just as good luck estimating whether we're at war right now or not.
I think it depends what time it is. What time is it?
Oh,
is it 3 o'clock? Like it all depends what time it is to determine whether or not we're in war.
Okay. The thing that kills me, I think, is that there's a huge amount of money going to this war. Some 37 billion, I think, has been spent already, and they're asking for how much? Another 50 odd billion. And I think we're up to 16 soldier deaths that we know of. Apparently, rumors are they're hiding quite a number of deaths. Logan, what's it gonna take to get Congress to start nipping Trump in the butt on this?
Oh, I actually think they are. It was really hard for Trump to get Republicans on board in the House, and they are about as loyalist as a group as you can possibly get. And they're struggling a heck of a lot more in the Senate. So I think that there's one thing which is a much higher bar for them to outright condemn him, but for them to go along into an election is very different. And this is a focal point that I think everyone has missed on the timeline, because senators, most of them have been around long before Trump. and some of them will be there long after, compared to some of the House members who are newer, and they are up every 2 years. A lot of these guys who were elected, who have elections coming up this year, are some of the ones who are more naturally resistant to him, and they had to wait till after their primary days. A lot of those primaries have passed. A lot, even more of them have passed to register for the primary, so there's no threat if they didn't get a serious opponent. So now they have 6 years. They have 6 years, they're in safe red districts, and they don't have to go along with what he wants because, to some degree, if they retire in 6 years, that doesn't sound like the worst thing in the world because, remember, most of these senators are now spring chickens. And second of all, who knows if Trump's going to be as relevant in 6 years, if he'll be around at all, and if he'll really care about this one specific thing, regardless of all the other stuff that'll pressure them on. So I think that you're seeing a lot more resistance to some of his ideas in the Senate, and you need 2 houses to get anything done. They're completely ignoring his desires to get rid of the filibusters so he can pass his election reform, if I'm being generous in what I would call it. That's dead in the water. They keep saying they'll consider it, but it's very obvious no one's considering it. They're just delaying it so he gets a little less mad. So we're in a very different place than we were a year ago, where he got Republicans to support just about the most unpopular policy you could do of cutting Medicaid. I don't think he'd have any chance of getting something like that done right now.
Denise, is Logan right? Is this part of the disassociating? That's going to get edited. Is this part of that distance creation that Republicans are going to do to try and get them out of the Trump shadow so that they do have a good chance in 6 years from now?
100%. I also think that they have a lot of scars. I live in Texas, and people feel away. Republicans feel away about John Cornyn being set aside. People who they perceive as actual Republicans. In our state, it was particularly pointed. Here's Ken Paxton, this defective candidate in every single way. I think there is a desperation to wash themselves of the kind of the filth of Donald Trump. And so I think they're going to look for opportunities to distance themselves, because I think it's going to be a litmus test of character in about 3 minutes. Once Trump is assuming that this whole conversation about a third term, which is offensive in and of itself, but there's a point where he just won't matter in the same way anymore. And so I think the conversation then shifts to, how do you govern and can you govern? And in a Mamdani world, they simply cannot have this level of incompetence in the actual execution of the job that has been exhibited in the last couple of years. That's just not going to stand. So I agree with Logan. I think that they're excited to have opportunities to differentiate from him, especially if it aligns with the polling on the American people. And the Iran war could not be less popular. So I think it's a win-win for them to start to differentiate and distance themselves from him.
But the slur that they used internally to knock each other down was calling somebody a rhino, right? If you were not sufficiently aligned with Trump, you got the rhino tag, which was a lot of times was a death note. Do you agree that slur has diminished? And continue with what you were going to say.
Yeah, I think there's also a difference here in that they have the long term, right? These House members, Trump is so popular in the GOP, his endorsed candidates are winning at high rates right now. So the Republican Party is more on board with the Iran war than they were at the start, mainly because it wasn't Trump's thing, and he has massive influence in the echo chamber that is right-wing media, both on social media and on the radio and on TV. So they've rallied around him consistently enough that I don't think they love it, but they kind of like it, right? There's some weakness there. If you look at people, you ask people, do you strongly approve of the president? It's only 20% of America. That is massive shift from the last term, where most people that liked him loved him, right? There's a lot of people that like him now. So I don't mean to overstate things. I do think there's some erosion here. But these senators get to do 2 things that are different than the congressman and congresswoman. First, I genuinely think, even though principles have come second most of the time in this party of late, with power, it gives you the chance to do more of what you believe in. And they have more power than congressmen just because they're not up for a while and they can focus on the long game. And now people will probably forget about anything happening now. The second thing is, we already know where the Iran war is going to be heading. This is not going to be viewed as a success by the American people. Oh my gosh, were Republicans on board with the Iraq war at this point? Heck, at this point, Democrats kind of were too. There was only a slight erosion. So We know where this is going to head because it's been a disaster. Americans are going to turn on this hard. Whether it's a focal point for them, I don't know, but no one in 6 years is going to be mad that you didn't support the Iran war long enough. I just think with these House members, sorry to be repetitive here, it's not that people are going to be that mad at them for supporting it. It's just that Trump will come at them with a sledgehammer and destroy them if he can. And they can't really survive that because most of them don't have strong enough identities. Thomas Massie almost did, and he raised an enormous amount of money, and he still held off, even though Republicans agreed with him in that district on his disagreements. It was him versus Trump that narrowly cost him his election. So the guy's not dead yet, right? He's less powerful than he was a year ago, but I also think, sorry, I'm being a little long here, but I just think one extra thing. I don't think Trump is being treated like the terrible president that he is. He's getting treated like a bad president. The rules of normal political gravity to some degree are affecting him as if he was a bad president, but people aren't abandoning him in droves. He's a guy for 38% approval rating that's popular with his party. And if you just knew that and you didn't know how crazy he was being or the long-term damage he was doing to the country, the reactions of the politicians make sense across the board.
Do you think that holds post midterms when the trial starts, when the subpoenas are issued and when things start being surfaced more on a daily basis of like exactly how terrible it is? Do you think, assuming that the House shifts, do you really think that that Trump will be able to withstand real scrutiny of some of these kind of finer points of like actual criminality?
Yes, but I'm not certain because, again, the 20% strongly approved number is by far the biggest red flag. That was a big red flag for Biden early on in his first term, even when he was actually really popular for his COVID response. There was very soft support, so you could see if the ship went down, it could take some hits. I just think he is very unique in American politicians. There's never been a president that has the same combination of extremely strong numbers with his party and extremely weak numbers with independents. He's as unpopular in some polling, perhaps on an average with independents, as George W. Bush was at the lowest point when his approval rating was just over the 20s, like in the very, very low 30s. But he is still so popular with his base that I think Republicans will go down with the ship if the ship ends up indeed sinking, and then they'll have a bad 2028 if that happens. Now, Americans are unbelievably forgiving. They love change. I don't think much is enduring unless Democrats become exceptionally popular and have an FDR moment. But I do think it could have big implications, and they're both not able to, and they're not used to breaking from him. And in the past, so many times it's been proven that breaking with him is risky. So if it actually is better to do it, I don't know if they'll really realize it until it's too late. And even for them, given how much primaries decide elections for most members now, it still might be in their interest to stick with him if he has a 25% approval rating, honestly.
I was just going to say the Medicare cuts are set to go into effect right after the midterms. And that will be interesting too, because his constituency is an older constituency. So when you start seeing like ripples of hospitals closing and like his folks start losing such a major benefit, I wonder how that's going to hold.
I honestly don't know how they sleep at night. And I know this isn't very unbiased political analysis to me to say, but both my parents grew up in poverty, so I take this stuff seriously. I don't know how they sleep at night cutting food stamps and cutting healthcare coverage at this specific moment so that they can cut taxes for the wealthy. Who looks at the wealthiest people like Elon Musk and thinks they're struggling and they need a little extra help from the government, and says to the poorest Americans who literally won Trump the election because they were so unhappy with the status quo that we're going to cut you down from your knees at the time where you need the help the most? It's unconscionable to me. And they knew it was going to be highly unpopular because, like you said, they waited till after the election. And I do think that they won't be able to escape it completely.
Logan, out of curiosity, besides gun rights and abortion restrictions, what do Republicans believe in?
Oh, Donald Trump. Not just Donald Trump, though. They believe in limited immigration. They believe in socially conservative policies. They are in opposition to the multiculturalism of America. It doesn't mean that they want Jim Crow, but they're uncomfortable with how much the country's changed. And some of them feel that they're left out of it. So there's obviously a race component to that. They believe in more conservative gender culture, where men are seen as leaders, maybe not with government policy, but in the dominant culture of the country. And they believe in less regulation. And that's a big part of why the Medicaid cuts passed, even if they were popular, not popular with the American people and not popular with the new Republicans that left the party, left Democrats to join them. They are popular with old Republicans, right? That's the central dividing line between the parties and has been for a while, is Democrats want government to do more to help poor people. And it's just gotten harder in this moment when people are struggling and left behind, the Republicans have changed their messaging and ignored that part. But those are still such a core part of their party, and they're not really been able to make the adjustment, which is going to make it really hard to keep some of this working class support if they keep doing this to them.
I thought that's an excellent description of what Republicans believe in, because all of it would be the Conservatives in the UK, with the exception of a patriarchal society. The Conservatives are now on their fourth female leader. That's not to say that they are, to use an American parlance, totally woke on gender issues, but they can be led by women, and even a black woman is their current leader.
Yeah, but she's not very nice, is she?
Did you see her closing remarks to Starmer last week?
Yeah,
She was
I
very
thought they were.
funny, incredibly
was unfortunate.
gracious, and she's won so many political points because of it.
Because she's been so rude in comparison, her being just slightly rude is seen as a victory. I disagree. She's not.
She wasn't even slightly rude. It was
She
it was a great parliamentary set piece moment. She had all those jokes lined up. She was gracious, and she's gone up in my estimations as a parliamentarian. And her approval ratings, I'm not saying approval ratings after that, have been steadily climbing. She's been much more effective as a leader of the opposition, considering potentially the Conservative Party were facing extinction because of reform.
I am going to use my new favorite AI tool, Claude, and ask if anyone ever has used the word gracious to describe her final PMQs with Starmer at all. But it does sound, Logan, based on what you said, that if our friend Farage does lose in Clacton, then perhaps there's a U.S. representative spot waiting for him in Oklahoma.
If Trump endorses him, it's very hard to, you have to really do something wrong. Maybe being the leader of a UK party would freak people out when you're then running for office there. But honestly, I think that voters who love Trump, they just see the endorsement and trust his judgment a lot of the time. And if you see something terrible about someone, they can still lose. I actually think in Paxton's case, the guy is really smart when it comes to running Republican primaries, maybe not so much general election. We'll see how much he underperforms the rest of the party. But the guy did everything possible as Attorney General to tie his name with Trump. Anytime there was a political issue that he could get a lawsuit in and seize attention among the Republican Party faithful, he did it. And he did that for years. And so he did position himself to win. But normally someone that has done as many terrible, corrupt things as Ken Paxton, and if you ever heard of him, just spend 3 seconds on Google and you'll see what I'm talking about. Sometimes guys like him don't win even with the endorsement. But if you're savvy enough, you can get away with a lot these days.
Yeah, that's a good point. So there's been a number of really close Senate elections over the last 4, 6, 8 years, right? Where the margin of victory has been a point or 2 points or something. I'm thinking about Texas and Georgia and some other states, right? Is this the time that we see those states flip blue? Will we take the Senate in the midterms?
I'm going to leave Texas up for Denise because she's got on the ground experience there. But I think that Georgia could not look better for Democrats right now. Look, the state has been shifting very fast towards Democrats to begin with. It was only a point more conservative than the country in the last election relative to the popular national vote. And that's a massive shift for a state that used to be, I don't know if deep red, but certainly burgundy and consistently Republican. It might be at the point where it's at an even crossroads. Democrats just won their first statewide office last year in 2025. They won both offices by 20 points. Now, it wasn't a highly important office, but 20-point victory. My gosh. In Georgia for Democrats, when they hadn't won anything like that in 20 years, and I say statewide, that doesn't include the Senate when we're talking about the federal elections or the presidential. So I think that they're in a great chance to win the Senate race, probably by a lot. The governor race is harder because you have an unconventional Republican with a rags to riches story who has way more money. Keisha Lance Bottoms is competent, but not a good fundraiser. So I think she'll narrowly win, but it'll be closer, but could go either way. Now, when it comes to these other states, my model has Democrats at a 52% chance to win the Senate. Now, if you think that's me taking an out, look, I give a specific percentage and projection for every single race. I promise it's not that. I have an analytical model, and that's where it ends up. And the reason it gets there is because there's all these races in red areas where a lot has gone right for Democrats. They've got a good candidate advantage. They have a good national environment. The fundraising's been good for most of them. But these are still red areas. We're talking about a place like Alaska that, while it is shifting at a faster pace than any state in the nation towards Democrats, it's still 10 points to the right of the country. We're talking about places like Iowa that are about the same, but they haven't been shifting to Dems. Now, that state's been hit harder by tariffs than any other state, so it's in play, but it's still a tough place to win. Texas is kind of similar. It's moving slowly towards Democrats. There's some stops and hits in the other direction, but losses with Latinos might be moving it. A lot of Democrats and independents and some Republicans think that's what's going to happen, where there'll be enough to put it in play to the point that on huge candidate quality gap between Tallarico and Paxton, who I think is the most corrupt politician in the country that doesn't live in Washington, D.C. That might be enough. It might be enough. It's going to be tight, though. In Ohio, it's a tough one to win, probably going to win it. But basically, there's all these things that could very feasibly happen. It's possible all of them happen. It's possible none of them happen. Most likely, we get a split in the middle, and Democrats have to win 4 races. But if they win 2, or they win especially 3, they'd be in a great position in 2028, because you get 2, you're 1 seat short of 50. And if you win the White House, you get the VP as the tiebreaker, so you only need 1. And we got Ron Johnson sitting in Wisconsin, who keeps winning by the skin of his teeth in the perfect election cycle after perfect election cycle. 22 was not that necessarily, but Democrats thought it was going to be a tough cycle, so they didn't invest any money in Wisconsin. So that's a very pickable race. So I think they'd have a really good chance in 28 if they could pick up at least 2, which they probably should.
Yeah, based on what the stats were a year ago, I will take a 52% chance. And Roifield, you're extremely familiar with 52-48 percentages. But Denise, what's your take in Texas? Is Tallarico the guy?
I sure do hope so. It's tricky because he has really good name recognition at this point in the race, a lot better than Beto had, a lot better than folks in the past have had at this point. So I think he's definitely cutting through. And I think that he gives a lot of people pause. The folks that I'm talking to that kind of want to wash off, and they want somebody Republican adjacent. He feels Republican acceptable to me. And so people really like that. So does he grab independents and the Republicans that are tired of this season and want something else? Maybe. Where he does have a problem is how he got the nomination. And like there's a little residue of the Jasmine Crockett kind of discomfort that is cooling his biggest army, which is Black women, to go out and animate people to get to the polls, right? And that is what this is going to take, really getting Latinos to really step up and come and vote and say, you don't like this, you need to go and vote. That extra step, quite frankly, is usually closed by Black women. And how it all went down with Jasmine has left a little taste in people's mouth that they aren't as passionate or as willing to go door to door as they might have been in the past.
So 2 questions. Number 1, what has Jasmine Crockett done? Has she come out actively for his campaign? And then I guess question 2, given the ICE status of America, aren't we going to see a much lower Hispanic participation? Do you anticipate the fear of going to the polls?
Oh, I don't think I process that for citizens. I think citizens are going to go and vote in this election. Hispanic citizens are not afraid, I don't think. And I think especially large cities like Houston, Dallas, they're going to take extreme measures. I think mayors of large blue cities understand the assignment. They understand that they are at war and they have to literally battle the threats against this upcoming election. I think they're clear on that. So I don't worry about that. What I worry about is dispassion. Is let other people figure it out as opposed to, you have to go and figure it out. That's usually the challenge within the Hispanic community in Texas. It's you guys let us know how it went, as opposed to, y'all are a huge population. You need to drive how it goes. And so that's the issue I see with that community. Jasmine Crockett endorsed him when she lost, but they didn't invite her to the convention to speak until the very last minute. Their relationship is very rocky. And quite frankly, I don't blame her. It's like people who say, Kamala, do something. You do something. You didn't pick me. Go with the guy that you picked and get there on your own steam. So to kind of there was a lot of intimation in that process that she was unelectable because she's a Black woman. We need to go with a white guy. A white man, we can win. That messaging did not sit well with his strongest soldiers, who are the ones who animate people to get out to vote. So people feel like, okay, you break it, you buy it. You don't come to me and ask me to help you make it happen. I'll vote for you, but I don't know that you're going to animate with that rhetoric and that vibe that was palpable in that season. I think it was an energy drainer. Will it matter? Are people are these people not going to vote? Of course they're going to vote. They believe in voting, but will they animate the 20, 30, 40, 50 people that they got to vote in the past? Maybe not.
Roifield, are we going to see a Democratic Congress in November?
If Trump's unapprovals are as dire as all the opinion polls are saying, you struggle to see with that wafer thin majority that Republicans have in Congress that they can't do that. I appreciate the Senate is a slightly tougher hill to climb, but it would be a disaster if the Democrats, with this unpopular president, cannot take Congress.
Yeah, you can talk to Hillary about that. Last question, and I'd like to get everybody's responses.
Hey, Michael, real quick, and I had one extra thing to what Denise was saying and to what you were saying. So you were talking about, will ICE try to put the screws to Latino voters in Texas ahead of the election, essentially, and try to make them scared? I think that's very much a Trump playbook. Markwayne Mullin, who is now head of DHS, is much more of a cooler head than Kristi Noem, which is not a massive compliment when we're talking about Kristi Noem, who did everything she could to ruin the lives of Minnesotans and Chicagoans and Angelos. So I don't know if it's more his style. He can obviously be overruled. That being said, I think Georgia might be an example to look at because there was a lot done. Everyone forgets because Governor Kemp stood up to Trump when he tried to overturn the election, but there were a lot of shenanigans to make it harder for Black voters to vote there. Democrats spotlighted it, and as has been shown throughout American history, the number one way to mobilize people to vote is to feature a government that is trying to take away their rights or reduce their free speech. And I think that's particularly true with Black voters in Georgia, which was the heart and soul of the civil rights movement and resistance against Jim Crow. So there's still an infrastructure there that was easy to rally. But it had a very powerful effect that changed the state in the long term, because once people start voting, they don't usually stop. So you might see that if that happens. Because Denise was talking about people can be dispassionate, prefer Democrats. If they really go in that, I think it's possible it works, because then people are scared for their safety, not just whenever their right to vote will be counted. But I still think you will have more of a powerful pushback, because it's not easy to become a citizen. It is a hard process to win those rights. And I don't think people appreciate when you try to take that away and you try to just make their lives hard because of the color of their skin. And I think that mistake has already hurt them a great deal in Texas and in Arizona and in many other places. I think that they had a golden opportunity to gain a meaningful, serious ground for Latinos, and they're probably making it a one election thing. I'm not saying they can't win them in the future, but right now, a lot of people feel betrayed. They thought, whether Trump said that or not, he obviously didn't, but a lot of people thought that he was just going to have more of an anti-immigration approach to new immigrants coming in. They didn't expect him to be tearing apart families, and they didn't anticipate being racially profiled everywhere they go.
Last question, and I'd like to hear from everybody on this. Are we going to have unfettered elections in November, Logan?
Unfettered is a strong word. Do I think Trump will try to do hijinks? Yes. I think that he will fail mostly in the courts. I think that they have a low tolerance for this. But he will certainly try. He'll probably have some wins, mainly in states that maybe it matters less, but some of which are quite red. We've certainly seen Greg Abbott do things in Texas that make it harder to do vote by mail in cities. So that's already happened. So you're not going to have a perfect and completely fair election. Do I think ultimately the will of the American people will triumph overall? If an election is decided by 0.2% and they've done all these hijinks, then yeah, it can alter the result. It's hard to know for sure whether it would or not. But I think ultimately overall, if the nation strongly prefers a Democratic House, they will get a Democratic House. And if the state of Texas strongly prefers a Democratic senator, they will get a Democratic senator. These things matter at the margins, and on the rare case that ends up being decided by 0.1, 0.2, those things can be decisive, but they cannot be. They're not powerful enough, with our judicial system being what it is, at least at this point, to overwhelm that, in my view.
When you asked the question, my immediate answer was no. We will not have an unfettered election. I think that this is existential for the Republican Party. I think these are not issues of kind of party politics and policy actions. I think it's existential about maintaining a hierarchical structure and the kind of power dynamic they want to maintain. So I think it's means necessary to compromise or sabotage that. And so consequently, the folks that I'm talking to are rolling up their sleeves and ready to throw elbows because they do not perceive it as fair or standard in any way. Everyone is anticipating a hostile posture towards especially Democrats voting. That's kind of the standard that we're all expecting, especially in the major cities like Houston, Dallas, whatever, at which the legislature does Houston specific laws. That's how adversarial our relationship is with the state as a whole. So I think that I do not underestimate the sheer amount of dollars. I think it'll be a lot of social media manipulation, direct mail manipulation. Oh, voting Tuesday. No, you can vote on Thursday. Voting poll is here. No, the voting poll is there. I anticipate a lot of those kinds of things that are about deception and the little man, things that money really creates power around. A lot of those things we're looking at. I think that they're trying to reduce the number of polls that we can have in Houston. Houston has the largest geographic sprawl in the country, right? So you one or two is really disenfranchising people and inhibiting for them from being able to vote. So I think it's going to be just the way they run the Trump administration. It's going to be 1,000 fronts. It's not going to be one thing or two things. It's going to be all on all these different fronts. And we just have to be smart and savvy. And I do think people are organizing with that in mind.
I think Denise is right in Texas. I just want to say, I think I lowballed it a lot. And I think Texas is literally the most dangerous state for that in the country because you have a Republican unified control. They are terrified that Democrats will. There's a possibility that this state becomes a swing state. It's not a guarantee. And they're willing to use extrajudicial means to achieve it. They have a very corrupt governor in Abbott and a state legislator that's scared of Trump and Abbott. And so they're going to have to run interference. I think you have places like Alaska where the Republicans are a lot more independent minded, Iowa to some degree. And so this is where it can matter the most. And then obviously in the House, I don't know why I didn't say this. I'm sorry I'm talking a lot, but it's such an important point to make. Obviously, gerrymandering is a huge problem here, and it got worse, right? Because the Congress a long time ago in the Voting Rights Act and passed restrictions on states in the South's ability to draw lines that would disenfranchise Black voters. And the Supreme Court, as they always do, seem to think racism is gone and that these protections are no longer necessary and have mostly gutted those. And so we're seeing a few states, 4 to 5 races be shifted towards Republicans at the very last second here. And so that means that Democrats might have to win by 4%. Well, I think they do that. Yeah. And it might not be that much because they keep overperforming in all these swing races because they're recruiting better candidates these days. But frankly, there wasn't much of a pathway to Republicans winning the House before that happened. Now there is, even if it's narrow.
Do you guys feel like there's any credence to the concept that Republicans are realizing that their grip on power is slipping, that their core constituency is either aging out or their policies are unpopular or whatever, and they're simply trying to consolidate power because they see another 10, 15, 20 years of being in the wilderness if everything is fair? Is there any credence?
That's what, when I said it's existential, that's what I mean. The reality is that Indian kid that came over on an H-1B visa, you're not competing with him, sir. You don't have a degree. There's a fundamental reality that they're being outpaced as a population. They're making choices to not go to college, to this trad wife thing. They're making choices that inhibit their ability to actually compete with that immigrant that's coming with $300 in their pocket and is going to work 14 hours a day to make something happen. And so in the face of that, they're trying to consolidate and secure structural, systemic authority as opposed to a true meritocracy. And yet you can see that in the policies that shift, right? Like all of a sudden, we used to be super fiscally conservative. Wait a minute, not if that, we'll spend any amount of money to maintain the status quo, right? And so they are conserving. That's what's going on. And in a face of growing minority populations, increased power among women, the competitive force that immigrants are in the United States, they're not equipped to compete. So the only place they can compete is in existing wealth and existing structures and shoring them up. So to me, I agree 100%. I think it's existential. They have to do this. They don't really have an alternative. Their ideas are not popular generally. And people are now empowered to say that. And definitely social media isn't helping them at all.
Roifield, just perfect timing. Was that the new PM calling to get your advice on something?
Absolutely.
Maybe a
Absolutely.
cabinet position? Roifield, are we going to have free and fair, unfettered elections this November?
I worked for an organization called OSET when I was in California, who developed technology around the American voting system. They would say that your American democracy is fragile. And however, what I'd counter that by saying that, as Logan said, the American judicial system was pretty robust back in 2020 when Trump tried to deny the result of many of those elections in various states. I think it was 56 counts were launched and 55 were thrown out and one was ambiguous. I could forget how that ruling went. So I have faith in the American judicial system. I don't have faith in the current American administration to administer a free and fair elections. But there are just about enough checks and balances on malfeasance when it comes to American elections. Just about.
You're
The
wrong.
saving grace is that every state controls their own elections. So that
Well-
if it were the Trump administration administering it, and that's part of what the SAVE Act that he's trying to get passed that has zero chance is trying to do, we would be in a much, much darker place because, as we've seen, Trump will use any system of power he can to benefit himself and his allies. But that it doesn't offer a saving grace to Texans because there's a few states like Texas where they are really manipulating things to an extreme degree. But for the country as a whole, it's a real backstop, especially because Democrats did really well in 2018 and 2022, won a lot of governorships, won a lot of state legislative seats. And so there's not many places that are competitive where Republicans have unified control.
But the reason that you're wrong is that because we have now come into this bizarro world where anything the Trump administration doesn't like, they immediately take it to district court. The judge will rule against them, and then for some special reason, it goes immediately to the Supreme Court, who then rule in his favor. So the past sort of sensible filtering is out the window now, to be honest. Everything seems to go directly to the Supreme Court. And even the worst decisions seem to be, or the worst sort of most obvious decisions seem to be a toss-up now. So
I hear you, but it hasn't your Supreme Court, when it comes to constitutional matters, recently given Trump the odd little bloody nose, that even they have not completely nothing rolled over.
I don't know, completely is they're picking his nose while giving him a hand job. It's not right. It's,
A very sexy image, Michael.
that's kind of the interaction that it feels like. They may minorly quibble, but not only have they done things that are unconstitutional, they've overturned decades of Supreme Court precedents, the Chevron case and a whole bunch of other cases in the last 2 years. It's been a complete dismantling of the norms of our Supreme Court.
I
And
would
for that
also,
reason, they're members.
yeah, I would also add to that, like all of these things that seem small and innocuous, that don't rise to the level of it going to the Supreme Court. For example, like the SAVE Act is asking for states to turn over voter information. Texas, Abbott just gave it to him.
Yeah.
So he has all of our information right now. And so what kind of marketing, what kind of direct contact, what kind of sabotage, that's not even a surfaced issue or a surface place of friction and contact that we're even talking about. So yes, the Supreme Court may or may not, that's a coin flip if they're going to hold up the Constitution, but there's all these little places. That's all you need to win an election, right? If you got enough money, and they've got an awful lot of money.
Last thoughts, quick statements, and where people can find you online. We'll start with Logan.
My last thought is that I still think that even though these challenges are real, at the end of the day, the American people get to decide this, especially if their feelings are decisive. We have a lot more power than we think sometimes. Trump has gotten considerably weaker over the last year, and that doesn't happen if there's not resistance from the American people. Remember we were talking about this. We had a great conversation, Michael, a few months ago, or back in the early parts of the year, where there were mass movement in Minneapolis that got the entire country's attention and got Kristi Noem fired, and ICE is still a huge problem, that they are massively different than they were before then because it was bringing down the administration and
They're
their
killing more
popularity.
people and more
I,
different.
I still think it's horrible, but when something is as horrible as they were, it can still be an absolute nightmare and have a different approach because they were just to fuck with people, making the lives of every Minnesotan as awful as possible, trying to create chaos and violence. We saw all across Minneapolis, they were aiming guns at people every time they issued an order. It's amazing that so few people were killed there. So I am certainly not saying the status quo is acceptable. That's the opposite of what I'm saying. I'm saying that people taking up and protesting did change things. And we've seen a massive shift in special election after special election in Democrats' favor. So is our democracy and our system of rule weakened? Yeah, it absolutely is. But it's sure as hell not dead yet. And Americans still have control over their future. So I think for those that are upset about what's happening, it's really good that you're listening to podcasts like this and you're watching probably the news and sharing stuff online. But we need you to do more, right? Because democracy, it's not a sport you watch from the TV. You got to get your hands wet. And I know it's hard to do after your heart's been broken, but we need you right now because we can change things for the better. And in 2 years after that election, we can change a heck of a lot more and try to solve some big problems because the American people are more than any time, I would say, since the Great Depression, in a mood for big change, to make things better, to make things more fair. And when the American people are in a mood for big change, that's when we finally achieve these big goals of ours. So don't give up hope, keep hope alive, and keep fighting. That's my message. And if you want to hear, I don't know if I'm not normally this good on Twitter, right? But Logan R2WH.
People can find you at Twitter at Pollyanna.
Logan R2WH. Logan Race to the White House, or follow racetothewhitehouse.com.
Denise, final thought and where we can find you.
Man, I couldn't agree more, Logan. I think that we're in the middle of a really ugly time and we're not anywhere close to the end. So we need some stamina and we need some seriousness about what the challenge is before us. It's really ugly and it's really dark and it takes a different level of savvy and thoughtfulness about how we're going to navigate this season. I've been thinking a lot about season 1 of Game of Thrones. And if I'm Ned Stark, I don't want my head to end up in a basket, right? This is where we are. We need to understand the battlefield that we're on, and we need to prepare ourselves. Gird your loins and get ready because it's going to be ugly. It's going to take real work. Pushing a button on social media is not the same as real work, right? And we have to actually get out and vote and take personal responsibility for getting 10 people, 15 people, 20 people to the polls, right? Just imagine if everybody who feels passionate about this season took that responsibility, what would happen, right? And I can be found at official DHAM in all of the places, but it's great to find me, but I really want you to find yourself. Get to work and find a place that you can be impactful.
I feel like I'm at the end of an Avengers movie where they're all getting together and give them the big speech before the big fight. There's a lot of vigor in this room. Roifield, bring us down. Bring us back.
I'm absolutely not, because this is the first time I've been positive about British politics since Brexit. So I've had 10 years of feeling like this country is inexorably going in the wrong direction. In America, you call people of the left progressives. We don't have that. We don't use that term over here. We don't mind saying you are a social democrat or democratic socialist, etc. But fundamentally, what for me unites the left is progressive thoughts, which are fundamentally about an optimistic future, that we can overcome problems and the future will be better for the first time in 10 years. are being the British, that the future of Britain is now much more positive because we have a political leader who has recognized and is saying it out loud within the poop people, and is doing incremental steps to make people's lives better. We didn't talk about this before, but capping national bus fares at £2 is incredibly powerful. If you're on income, if you're on minimum wage and you've got to get to work, that over a week is going to put an extra £10 in your pocket. We can't underestimate some of the things that this man has said. The jury is out as to whether his tenure will be a success. It's only been in place for 3 or 4 days. But the mood in this country has changed. So I'm pretty positive. So I'm with Denise and I'm with Logan, right? I'm proud to be a lefty, progressive, and I do believe that the future is out.
And where can people find this beacon of optimism?
I don't do social media, though I do have a Substack, which is very out of date, just Roifield, ROI Field. You'll go find it on Substack.
The world wants to hear from you, Roifield. It's been a while. All right.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you all for watching, and watch this space. We'll be back. Thank you.